Okay, we are recording.
Terrific. So most of you were here last week. Joan, I don't know if you were here last week. You're muted, so I can't hear you, but I saw you mouth. I was not, so I understood. Okay. It's a two-part. This is a two-part class dedicated to the memory of my teacher, Rabbi Dr. David Weiss Halivni. And I'm hoping that this time I will have gotten the text set up in advance so that it will be more effective. You should be seeing my PowerPoint screen. Yeah. Anonymity and Annihilation, Rabbi Dr. David Weiss Halivni. Paul? Yeah.
Just reacting to the title.
The title, okay. Yeah, the title might not have been the best choice, especially since, well, you'll see where I'm going with this. So I'll review a little bit of his biography. It'll be helpful for Joan, and it'll be good review for other people. It'll also give me some opportunity to share with you some other material. So Halivni was, as I mentioned, by the time I came to work with him in 2000, he was already a legendary figure. And you need no further proof of this than the fact that in 1977, the New York Times Magazine ran a profile of him, an excerpt of which I have on the slide now, called "A Life in the Talmud." You could see the title, below the title: "For centuries, Jews have accepted the commentaries of the sages as divine, even when they didn't make sense. A bold scholar, David Weiss, has devoted his life to making them plausible." And last week I tried to give you an inside example using that one passage, an inside example of how fundamental how revolutionary his approach to the Talmud was. I spoke about how he took the materials of the Talmud that other people, and traditional readers particularly, had just taken to be a kind of like the air circulating around something, like the air circulating around the rabbis, like not really significant, not really important. And he focused on it and activated it and demonstrated how those editorial anonymous texts that seem like they might just be filler are actually doing some of the most important work in the Talmud. And that the other piece of it is that, to get into this New York Times thing, one of the reasons why he did what he did in terms of that approach was it resolves a lot of illogical questions. A lot of times texts will seem to be illogical, or someone with a kind of critical brain that Halivni had will find moments of the text that just aren't working, that are contradictory, or they kind of fall apart under closer scrutiny. This new theory of the strong editorial hand and the ability to separate between the attributed materials, the rabbis, the sixth generation of rabbis whose ideas are being cited in the Talmud, as opposed to the anonymous editorial generation that is just framing what came before, and also saying things not in anyone's name, but they're just kind of laying out ideas without attribution. That sensitivity to that gap allowed him to really open up understandings of the Talmud and to really resolve things that are thorny. And I'm going to get back to this. I'm going to get back to this later on when I talk a little bit about his theology. So in terms of the review, he was a child prodigy in Sighet. Sighet is in Transylvania. At the time, he thought of himself as Hungarian. And his native tongue was Yiddish, but he also understood Hungarian. And I mentioned that Elie Wiesel was also from Sighet. And he survived in a labor camp adjacent to Auschwitz, and comes to the United States. I mentioned the story of how he came into the orbit of Professor Saul Lieberman of the Jewish Theological Seminary, and in him found a kindred spirit and mentor figure. And after moving to the Jewish Theological Seminary, he would spend 30 years there, first as a student and then as a professor. He left JTS in 1985. He moved to Columbia, which if you're not familiar with New York geography, JTS is essentially on Columbia's campus. So he had actually always taught students at Columbia, whether they came down to JTS or whether he would teach them in a Columbia classroom as an adjunct teaching for Columbia. When he made the fairly public decision that he needed to leave the JTS over the procedure of their decision to ordain women rabbis, something that I talked about briefly last week. It's again a mark of his exceptionality that worlds were moved and people called up donors and prominent names in the Columbia Jewish Studies program, Salo Baron, called up the Litauer Foundation and said, what do you think about endowing a chair at Columbia for David Weiss Halivni? And then so he comes to Columbia as the Lucius Litauer Professor of Religion. And then he's in Columbia from 85 to 2005. So he's at Columbia for 20 years. So he taught for about 50 years in Morningside Heights. Not a bad run. I didn't mention this last week. In 2005, just as I was finishing my PhD, because I also finished my PhD in 2005, he moved to Israel. Now, there are some who want to see a connection there. He felt like his work was done because my doctorate was done. But no, the plan it really has nothing to do with me, but it did sometimes help me because people always sometimes said, oh, you're the last student of Halivni. That wasn't really true either, because there were people who had been accepted in the program who continued to work with him after he had moved to Israel. There were people who graduated as late as 2010 or 2011 who were still technically his students. Though in some of those cases, I was called in to be this kind of surrogate advisor because he was in Israel. He was not really reachable so easily by electronically and by our newfangled technology. So he goes to Israel, and he really had a tremendous, the last decade of his life, or the 10 years between 2005 and 2015 were absolutely, utterly amazing. He moves to Jerusalem. He lives, I don't know if you know Jerusalem, he lived in the Wolfson Towers, which are these kind of like large buildings that you see on Rehov Chaim Hazaz, which is a pretty broad thoroughfare that takes you quickly through much of Jerusalem. And it's where one of the super stalls is, and is like a drive-in, has a drive-in garage. He lived in the Wolfson Towers, and the Wolfson Towers were adjacent to Shari Chesed, which is a ultra-Orthodox neighborhood. But it's an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood that has a lot of American money in it. A lot of people with pied-à-terres, whatever the plural of that is. He was a regular shul goer. He went to services. He liked to daven with services 3 times a day with a minyan. So he would go to this synagogue called the Gra Shul, which is an ultra-Orthodox synagogue in Shari Chesed. And within a few months, he would be regularly teaching there. Because he would just talk to people and they would immediately get a sense of this brilliant Talmud scholar. Most of them had no idea who he was. He was just a kind of like an older man. He looked like kind of fit into the neighborhood because he had the right beard, and then he could talk Talmud with anyone. So they had no idea this was someone who had spent the bulk of his life in the conservative movement in the United States and was cutting edge on many Jewish legal issues. He was just the person who spoke between Mincha and Marav at the Gra synagogue. It reminds me actually when my sister went to Columbia for college, as did I. And at some point she ran into Professor Halivni on his way to afternoon services that the students conducted in the Hillel. We didn't have a real Hillel at the time, so we were meeting in just an all-purpose center. And my sister mistook him for a stranger who was lost, and tried to direct him so that she would make sure that he got to the right place for services. Because he kind of looked out of place. He looked old world in a way that many professors at Columbia didn't. But he actually was quite comfortable. Anyway, back in Israel, he ended up what he did was every day he would wake up and he would walk to the National Library, which is the Hebrew University's Mount Scopus campus houses Israel's National Library. And for me, it's like a fantasy of where I want to work. I often like want to just go to Israel for a week so I can hang out there, because the National Library main reading room has about 1,000 books, maybe even more, multiple thousand books on reserve in the room that can never be checked out. And it's all of the things that Jewish studies scholars, like the staples of Jewish scholars, the staple reference books of Jewish scholars, are in this room. And because of that, and because also of the people, there are like 3 rows of 10 desks that are next to each other. It's not fancy at all, but every day when you go there, it's a who's who of Israeli academia. Regardless of what schools people teach in, everyone is doing their work in this one place. So if you're an academic in Jewish studies, going there is like, you can just look and see. And I've occasionally had situations where I was like studying something and I needed some Judeo-Arabic, which I didn't have. And I just asked someone, they're like, oh, that guy over there specializes in Judeo-Arabic. I mean, so it's really a remarkable place. And for Halivni, you know, he showed up there and they gave him a set spot. So he had a makom kavua, a place where he could sort of leave his stuff and come every day. Came every day, and as was typical, you know, he would come early in the morning and leave late at night, or you know, the full hours of the library. And then after he was there for a few months, they had him start teaching. People wanted to hear him teach. So, you know, once a week he would offer a class in some room off the library, and you know, 25 people would pack it and listen to him speak. And you know, for him, this was, you know, the kind of audience of really learned people who could really appreciate what he could do. And through that, he ended up also getting recruited to teach at Bar Ilan University. Bar Ilan is a modern Orthodox university in Israel. And again, in the United States, modern Orthodoxy rejected Halivni because he was affiliated with the conservative movement. But in Israel, these denominational affiliations don't matter in the same way. So Bar Ilan University invited him to teach at Bar Ilan. And so he would go once a week. One of the professors at Bar Ilan would drive him from Jerusalem to Ramat Gan, where Bar Ilan is located. And he would speak to a large audience of mostly men, some women, but everyone in the room yeshiva trained, everyone in the room coming with a very strong Talmud background, many of them alumni of Hesder yeshivas, where you go to the army, but you also spend 3 years studying Talmud. And this was an audience that he had, you know, he never really had those opportunities in the United States. When he taught his seminar at Columbia, I was in that seminar for several years. It was a pretty high level seminar, but there were also undergraduates from Columbia who, you know, were just breaking their teeth on Talmud. And there were also graduate students who specialized in Christianity who had never seen Aramaic before. And he had to, you know, speak to everyone in the room. In Israel, in these places, he could really do the high level stuff that he did in his Talmud commentary. So that's a review of his life again. And now I'm going to get into some. So what is he known for? He's known for 3 things. He's known for his approach to Talmud, and he's known for his theology, and he's known for being a Holocaust survivor. And I'm going to get into all of these things. But I wanted to wrap up what I was talking about last week about his Talmud contribution by talking a little bit about the larger ramifications. So like I was focusing on the very narrow ramification last week, like when you're studying Talmud, whenever you encounter anonymous, unattributed material that's written in Aramaic, in light of Halivni, you have to ask yourself who's talking and what are they saying and how does it interact with the named rabbis? Are they just moving the named rabbis' ideas along, or are they carving them in a certain way? Are they distorting them? Are they shifting them? Are they disagreeing with them? Halivni encourages us to do that. And I mentioned that for Halivni, essentially what he did was he created or he filled a very important gap in the history. Because we know a lot, or we think we know a lot, about the Amoraim, the rabbis whose views populate the Talmud. And I mentioned last week, there are at least 6 generations of such rabbis, and they range in date. People were pressing me on this, and it's a very controversial question. They range in date from 200 to at least 400, and some would argue 500, though I don't see mathematically how that's possible. So For 2 centuries, the Amoraim are, when we talk about Judaism and Jewish ideas, we know who we're talking about. We're talking about these Amoraim, and we have names of people, like 100 names that fill this gap. We have Amoraim from modern day Iraq or ancient Babylonia. We have Amoraim from modern day Israel or ancient Palestine. But in terms of historical record, our historiographies become very confident again in the 8th century with the rise of Islam. The rise of Islam in the 8th century introduces a new era, the era of the Geonim. The Geonim were figureheads who ran highly institutionalized yeshivas in Babylonia. We have a lot of data about the Geonim. We have a lot of texts from the Geonim, including, as I mentioned last time, a lot of responsa. So these are letters that the Gaonic academies wrote in response to questions about Judaism that they received from lots of places in the Jewish world. Kairouan, which is in modern day Tunisia, or Egypt, or Yemen, or places from modern day Saudi Arabia. People were writing to the Gaonic academies in modern day Iraq and saying, can you clarify this matter of Jewish practice? Can you clarify this matter of Jewish law? And the Gaonic academies would sit and they would study the Talmud and they would digest it and they would think about the different possibilities, and then they would publish an official response. We have these responses. So we have a lot of data from the 8th century, but what we don't have is we don't have much between 400, let's say, and 800. We just don't. That's a pretty big gap. And in the historiography, so one of these responsa, in case you're interested, there's I had it out on my desk because I was reading it recently and I must have put it back. Oh, there it is. This is an English translation of something that's called, this is an English translation done within a confessional context, so it's by a non-academic press. It's a very orthodox translation, so it's got the transliteration into Ashkenazic Hebrew. The Igeres of Rav Shira Gaon. So in more normal transliteration, it would be Igeret Rav Shira Gaon, the letter of Rav Shira Gaon. And what this basically is this is a single responsum where the Jewish community in Kairouan asked one of the Gaonim, Rav Shira Gaon, in the 10th century, they asked him a kind of historical question. They asked him, what is the Mishnah? Where does it come from? And why is it authoritative? And the reason why they were asking him this question is because they were dealing with the newfound Karaite controversy, where the Karaites were challenging rabbinic notions of Judaism. And they're like, so the leaders of the Tunisian Jewish community who were trying to resist the criticisms of the Karaite leaders, they wanted better information, like tell us more about our history, tell us more about the Mishnah and how this process and Midrash and how this whole thing came about. And so Shira Gaon wrote back what is now printed as a book, but it was essentially a single letter that detailed, in his view, how things were put together. So in his history, he talks about the Amoraim, and then he says between the Amoraim and the Gaonim, there was a group of people known as the Savoraim. The Savoraim. And he gives us he names some names of people, and modern historians don't know how reliable his information is, because a lot of times his information is not reliable at all, because when we can verify it, we can test whether it's reliable. And on the Savoraim, it does not seem that he's particularly reliable. So again, like he's named the period. So generally within the historiography, people will talk about the rabbis who were between 400 and 800 and think of them as the Savoraim, but we don't really know what those people stood for or what they did. So what Shira Gaon says, and the reason why he calls them Savoraim is he says they sometimes helped to explain the Talmud. And he even says that sometimes their own words end up in the Talmuds that the Gaonic academies were studying. So he acknowledges that the Savoraim, that these rabbis between 400 and 800 might have played a role in the Talmud as we have it. What Halivni essentially does is he says the Savoraim are the Stamaim. You want to know what was going on between 400 and 800? The anonymous layer of the Talmudic text fills that gap. The anonymous layer of the Talmudic text represents an editorial layer of a group of rabbis who chose not to give us their names, but were active during this middle period and who are responsible largely for editing the Talmud and are responsible for the text that we have it now. The implication of this is that if you went through the Talmud and mined it and you basically consistently separated the attributed rabbis from the editorial texts, you could in theory do something like a cultural history of that middle period. Because now we kind of, like, with this idea, you now have some information. And this is what Halivni's student Jeffrey Rubenstein has, these books, which really, you can see they really should be a set. Like they're printed with the covers that clearly communicate that they're supposed to be a set, but they've never been sold as a set. Talmudic Stories, The Culture of the Babylonian Talmud, and Stories of the Babylonian Talmud. These are actually pretty accessible English books. And essentially what they're doing is they're doing exactly what I'm describing. Based on Halivni's insights, he has this other one, which is called Rabbinic Stories, which is a textbook that people use in class, which some of the same stories that he covers in these other books. In light of Halivni, he's pointing out that there are certain cultural things that we can now identify as being specific to that time period, the period between 400 and 800. So there's implications that come out of Halivni's method beyond the technical and narrow that I was talking about last week. Like it just gives us new tools for understanding our history. Any questions before we go on? Okay. So I mentioned last week that even though the New York Times obituary, was somewhat disrespectful in saying that Halivni was something of a theologian, that kind of downplayed the fact that he actually published 3 works of theology. And even his Midrash, Mishnah, and Gemara, which is a English language monograph about Jewish law, halacha, it also has some theological components to it, because it's not the kind of detailed Talmudic analysis that he does in his usual commentary. It's a second order reflection on what are Midrash, Mishnah, and Gemara, how do they interact with each other, what are the implications of their hermeneutics, what are the implications of the assumptions that they're making in their interpretations of earlier texts. So it's again, it borders on theology. Now, one of the things that I will come back to also, within Rabbinic Judaism, there is famously a distinction, and I'll put it in the chat. There's a distinction between halacha and agadah. Does anyone want to try to define this?
Well, halakha is law,
Yes, thank you, Rick. Halacha is law.
and agadah is sort of stories.
Right. So agadah is a much more difficult term to define. Halacha is law, and agadah, people sometimes use the term lore. Sometimes people will use the term folklore. Rick went for stories. The truth is that agadah is a very capacious category. It includes stories, because there are a significant number of standalone stories in rabbinic texts, stories whose characters are the rabbis themselves or people in their world. But agadah is also used to describe stories about biblical characters, or any kind of comments and conversation around those mythological stories about the biblical characters, right? So if you have a Talmudic passage that's interested in Jacob and Esau and the stealing of the blessings, that discourse is agadah. And the reason why it's agadah is because agadah is best defined through a negative definition. Halacha is law, and agadah is anything that is not law. So in terms of our definitions, now, so the reason why I mention this is one of the things that typically gets put into the Agadah category, well, before I do that, let me take a step back. My first book narrating the law, which was based on my dissertation, was all about this distinction between halacha and Agadah. I basically said that whether we're honest, if we're honest with ourselves, much of the time when people do define Agadah, they do exactly what Rick did. They define Agadah as stories. So when you have stories in the Talmud, they're typically taken to be Agadah. And what this means is there's a certain way in which Jews have come to develop approaches to studying this material. They study the legal materials in a very intense, rigorous, systematic way with method and lots of commentary and arguing over precision and language and logic. And they want to make sure that every word and every sentence is sensible. When they get to Agadah, they kind of like, they read it, they translate it. That's cute. Oh, so God created the Leviathan and then they had a fight with each other. Okay, that's like some kind of interesting mythological thing. I'm not going to spend too much time thinking about contradictions between the Leviathan that I'm reading about in Talmud Baba Batra and the creation story of Genesis 1 that has no such Leviathan, right? Because that kind of approach, that kind of rigorous seeking out contradictions methodology is not employed in typical rabbinic discourse when you approach Agadah. What I did in my dissertation book was I pointed out that there are stories in the Talmud that come up in legal contexts and have legal ramifications. So there are stories that really just sit on the divide between these two discourses. And typically they don't activate the kind of work that's done when you're looking at normal legal sources. And so in my book, I kind of come up with a new methodology that goes back and forth between the methodology that's evolved to read rabbinic stories on the one hand, and the methodology that's evolved to read rabbinic law, and try to read past them and read them both in light of each other. Yes, Paul?
I'm just trying to understand. Could you just take the narration about Moses as a child and burning his tongue on the coals? Where does that fit in to your definitions and your examples here?
So Paul's talking about the famous story that shows up in Midrash. It features a lot of prominent figures in the biblical story because supposedly Pharaoh is sitting around with Balaam and with Job, right? There's like a who's who of biblical characters are sitting around with Pharaoh, and they bring this baby before him, and someone makes a claim. One of these distinguished Balaam makes a claim that this boy Moses is really special, and the way they're going to prove it is by putting, they're going to give the boy a choice between a rough diamond and a shiny coal, and most kids would touch the shiny coal, but Moses, because he's special, is going to touch the more expensive and less dangerous diamond. And in the midrashic story, as baby Moses is about to reach for the diamond, because he actually instinctively is a chosen one, an angel comes and pushes his hand, and he ends up touching the coal, and then he burns his finger, and then because his finger burns, he puts it on his tongue to get the burnout, and he burns his tongue secondarily. And that is why the Bible is always explaining that Moses is heavy of mouth and heavy of tongue, right? So the Midrash is doing really important work to explain and expand. It's a gap-filling Midrash that explains and expands the story of Moses. If you're interested in this kind of thing, James Kugel's work talks about these kinds of Midrashim. That is 100% Agadah. There's no legal anything there. It's entirely Agadah. So what I was going to say is in my work, I basically pointed out that stories are complicated because stories actually sit on the divide. You could say the same thing about theology. So typically theology is typically put in the Agadah camp. like thoughts, because theology, the study of God, typically the texts in rabbinic discourse that talk about God are what we would consider non-legal. They're not texts that have legal things in mind. The problem is that in the same way my book was about like stories that are legal, you can also find theology that has legal. That's what I was saying before about Midrash, Mishnah, and Gemara. Midrash, Mishnah, and Gemara is a book that's about law, but it's theology. So it like everyone would say it's a book about halacha, but it kind of deconstructs this dichotomy and points out that the dichotomy is a little bit problematic. Like you kind of have to sometimes acknowledge that if you just restrict yourself to doing what you typically would do with halacha, then you wouldn't necessarily get to what Halivni gets to in Midrash, Mishnah, and Gemara, the kind of abstract reflection about the nature of the history of the production of the text that has a lot in common with what we do when we're doing Agadah, when we're thinking about like abstract theology, abstract questions about the nature of God. When you're doing halacha, it's more like you're inside the text and you're analyzing it for a legal outcome. So Halivni wrote these 3 works of theology and this other work. Okay, so I want to now segue. I'm going to be getting towards the theology now, but I want to make some points about that'll set you up for it. And I want to do so by telling you 3 things that people don't realize about Halivni. The first thing that people don't realize, and if you didn't spend time with him, maybe if you just get him through the books, maybe it doesn't come out. I think it comes out in the books too. But he was a person of tremendous faith, right? He talked about, and what I mean by that is, I often explain to my students in my introduction to Judaism that Judaism is not a religion of faith. That Judaism is a religion of practice. And I refer to myself in certain sense as an atheist because I don't buy into conventional notions of an anthropomorphic God who sits in judgment on human beings in a kind of static way. Many of the conventional terms of the theology of Judaism, I can't accept, me personally. Everyone else is, but that wasn't Halivni. Halivni, right? So, and I would be justified in my position because someone like Maimonides runs away from traditional notions of God, runs away from the idea that God could have a body, runs away from the idea that God can have an ongoing providential relationship with individual human beings. Maimonides runs away from the idea that God even listens to our prayers and can, will heal the sick if we ask for it, right? He doesn't think that those things are true to Judaism. He has a much more philosophical, abstract approach to the God that he believes in, and that he believes in God and simultaneously says he has no knowledge of God. He can never get to knowledge of God, right? So Halivni's notion of God was not like that. He was a very traditional person, and he knew Maimonides. His undergrad major was in philosophy. He studied Maimonides' Jewish philosophy. He knew the Guide to the Perplexed. But that wasn't how he chose to adopt his religious persona. In his religious persona, he's a strong theist, believed in the God of, as described in the Hebrew Bible, as reflected in traditional rabbinic sources. And he believed he had a close providential relationship with this God. So again, this is the things people don't realize, because if you read a New York Times article about how, he's moving away from a notion that Talmudic ideas are divine, you get one sense of someone who's kind of like cutting away from tradition, who's sort of moving in the opposite direction of the kind of traditional faith that I associate with Ashkenazic Judaism, in the pre-philosophical area, the kind of faith that Rashi and the Tosafists had, right? So this is the kind of faith that I think that he had. It's something that people don't realize. The second thing that people don't realize is that he was a conservative with a small c. So not conservative movement, conservative with a small c. And I have to say, if I'm being honest, from my perspective, where I was coming from, frustratingly so. There were times when, because also you should know about my background, like I grew up on the divide between modern and ultra-Orthodoxy. I went to an ultra-Orthodox summer camp for 11 summers. By the time I came to work with him, I was moving in the other direction. I was moving towards progressiveness. I was moving away from conservatism, not conservative Judaism, but conservatism. And, you know, his conservative nature came out, of course, in the women rabbis conversation that was discussed last week. It also came out, you know, Riva made the point about male figures and their successes and the sort of the role that anti-feminism played in the unequal distribution of labor in the domestic space that facilitates it. I would say, you know, he was a fairly conservative person, but, you know, so much so that one of the things that kind of would frustrate me is, so I mentioned that by the time I learned with him in 2000, he had already been profiled by the Times Magazine 23 years before. His first commentary on the Talmud had been published in 1968. The radical ideas had been coming out since the early 70s. I was born in the early 70s. So his approach was something that I kind of already grew up with. And so by the time I came to his class, I did not need to be persuaded that Ravina and Rav Ashi could not have been the editors of the Talmud. He had convinced me of that, you know, 30 years or earlier with earlier writing. But because of the kind of person he was, he never really detached himself from the initial debates he had. And in a lot of ways, he wasn't even arguing with his historical contemporaries. He was arguing with historical predecessors who were not around to concede his points. So the people he was arguing with were people who had written their books in the 1910s, 1920s, or even people from the 1890s who had written books about historiography and had gone through the texts and tried to argue for different dates than the ones he was putting forth, or different interpretations than the one he was putting forth. And because Halivni was perpetually arguing with those people who were not around anymore, and because he was going through all of the Talmud, on every passage, he's still arguing with the same people. He wants to show them in every passage that he's right. They're not around to concede. So it's a kind of never-ending battle to sort of fight that fight and prove in every text, in every passage, that Ravina and Rav Ashi can't be the authors of the Talmud.
Isn't that sort of what the Talmud is like also? That the later commentators are commentating and the earlier ones can't respond, obviously.
Yeah, it is, but in the field of Talmud scholarship, it's a little bit unusual. Like my other mentor, Shama Friedman, who started writing his commentaries at around the same time as Halivni, and came to some of the same conclusions that Halivni at around the same time, and they were both colleagues on the Jewish Theological Seminary faculty, and so there's some debate about who got to the ideas first. But Friedman is very different because Friedman is still active. He's in his late 80s, and he's still publishing, and his later stuff builds on the earlier stuff. So it leaves behind the earlier arguments. It's kind of like established them, and it's moved on to deal with other things. Halivni never really moved on to deal with other things. He was just dealing with the same things over and over again. And I think it might be a function, I think this might be part of what you're getting at too, Rick. It might have been a function of the fact that he was trying to write a commentary on all of Talmud. And so what that means is you want to make sure that people understand in every passage of Talmud how your insight is reflected. And to a certain extent, you can't control the order that people are going to come to this material when they eventually approach it, right? They're going to come, if they start with Tractate Nazir, which is what Daf Yomi is in right now, you want to make sure that you can persuade them in Tractate Nazir that your approach is right, because that might be the one and only place where they come and study. So it could be that there's just a different goal in the kind of scholarship he was producing. The last thing I'll point out about him, that again, people don't usually realize, he was a chassid. He was a chassid. Now, when we think chassid, we think of the people with the side curls and either the furry hats or the satiny hats and the long coats. If we have a little bit more knowledge about Hasidism, we might think of people who are interested in storytelling and interested in singing, interested in a certain kind of spirituality. If you're familiar with Martin Buber's version of Hasidism, the Hasidic tales from Martin Buber, then you might have an appreciation of the kind of ethic of Hasidic teaching, that everyone in the world could be one of the 36 people who hold up the world. This kind of universal ethics of like treating everyone with equal importance and sort of not having the same hierarchies that sometimes happen within an elitist society in Judaism that values Torah knowledge, and which sort of in the 18th and 19th centuries in Eastern Europe, literally in Yiddish, you would talk about the Shena Leute, the sort of beautiful people, and everyone else, right? There were the beautiful people who had money or Torah knowledge, and then everyone else was like in its own category, right? So Hasidism responds and reacts to that. So if you know something about Hasidism, Hasidism is very keenly connected to Jewish mysticism. Jewish mysticism is a kind of anti-rational intellectual discourse. But it also is a very robust and distinguished, high-functioning intellectual discourse. And Halivni was raised in a Hasidic home, in a Hasidic family, in a Hasidic neighborhood. Later on in his life, he moved to the United States, and he did not adopt the trappings, the outward trappings of Hasidism, and he did not choose to live in a Hasidic enclave community. So people don't realize, but one of the things that's famous about that Halivni is famous for is he famously paraphrased a statement from other Jewish leaders. Other Jewish leaders had said that they had a compartmentalization problem, or a problem of cognitive dissonance, and the way they framed it was, the people I can pray with are not people that I can talk to, but the people who I can talk to are not the people I can pray with. This has been a common refrain for certain Jews since the Enlightenment, when many Jews found community intellectually with people who were unlike them. But when they wanted to go to synagogue, they wanted to have all kind of traditional experience of synagogue, right? So the people that they prayed with were traditional people who were not enlightened. The people they talked to were people who were enlightened. So they didn't talk to anyone in synagogue about their enlightened ideas, but they prayed with them, right? So this is kind of a famous dichotomy. But Halivni added to this, but I can live without talking. I can't live without davening, right? I can live without talking. I can't live without praying, right? So he was basically saying, like, ultimately, this crisis at JTS is forcing me to make a choice between two compartmental aspects of my personality. And I'm ultimately choosing that, like, I can't sacrifice on the religious side, like my religious persona, like I can't continue to be in synagogue with people, right? So, but the way he framed it was very different from how I would frame it. So I am genealogically the product of, my dad comes from a very strong line of German Jews. German Jews are very sort of logical, orderly, and my mom's family has a combination of Hasidic and Lithuanian, but the Lithuanian yeshiva bacher runs very strong there, and that's also sort of an anti-Hasidic. I would say I go to shul to talk, not to pray, right? So I can live without praying. I can't live without talking. So but Halivni was he was Hasidic, and that Hasidism, I think, and he was a person of faith, and prayer was a very important part of how he saw himself in the world. And I'll come back to that in his theology. So those are three things people didn't realize about him. Now here are three things that animate Halivni's theology. So when it came time to like handle theological questions, the first thing that troubled him was, first and foremost, the same mind that was studying the Talmud's legal passages and pointing out all of the contradictions places where there were textual problems, what he liked to call maculations. I've never heard anyone, I've heard the term immaculate used many times, but I've never heard anyone other than him use the non-negative maculate or maculations. But he would refer to maculations in the text, places where the text was imperfect. And he really had a streak. His stomach couldn't tolerate it. His brain would immediately gravitate towards anything that was illogical. And he would just like struggle, like he could not absorb it. And you're going to see how that affects his theology in a minute. The other animating feature of his theology is that, and this is a kind of dual thing, he was extremely committed to halakha. I mean, how could he not be? He was spending day and night studying the Talmud's legal materials and trying to make it sensible, right? Trying to make it plausible, the Times said, right? He is working out the kinks of Jewish law in its canonical texts. But that is itself a kind of, it cuts both ways. He was totally dedicated to a life of halakha. At the same time, no one knew more intimately than he did how much of halakha is determined by texts and textual interpretation and the challenges of transmission of texts. He was constantly dealing with manuscript corrections that he was proposing or he was finding. So he knew more than anyone that even in theology, like, how do we get to our knowledge of God? Well, we have the Bible, we have rabbinic texts, we have Kabbalistic texts, but they're all texts. And as texts, they all have problems. They have problems of transmission, they have problems of interpretation, they have problems of logic where they don't make sense. And right, so these are the things that are really animating Halivni. And the final thing is, of course, the Holocaust. And his experience with the Holocaust, I mean, the Holocaust affected him profoundly. And there are places in his writing where he says things very strongly, more strongly than other survivors. For example, he has a very strong feeling. He doesn't like it when people who narrowly escaped their homelands, but were not imprisoned or didn't go into hiding or weren't in a ghetto, when they are referred to as survivors. He has a whole section in one of his books where he says it very starkly, like, there's a big difference between people who were in Auschwitz and experienced the selection of going left and right. There's a big difference between people who are on cattle cars and people who smelled the stench of the crematoria. Like, for him, the Holocaust was something that was an embodied experience that lived with him and was a trauma that he never got over. And it was something that really affected the way he thought about religion. He thought that religion had to really deal with the Holocaust. Eventually, he would say in his later works that Judaism had two important revelations. One of them was the revelation at Sinai, in which God broke into history and spoke to, over 1 million people and gave them the 10 Commandments and the Torah, setting in motion sort of the covenantal relationship between God and Israel. And the second revelation happens in Auschwitz. The second revelation happens with the absence of God and the disappearance of God. Right. So the Holocaust, and I will say also, he was aware of some things of his Holocaust experience, and he probably wasn't aware of even more. I would often see him at departmental events, and he would be very apologetic to me because there would be a buffet, and he would take, 3 times or 4 times as much food as he was going to eat. And he would every time he would apologize to me and say, in the Holocaust, we never had any food. Right? I'm always nervous that I'm not going to have food. So I always take, if there's food in abundance, I always take because maybe I won't have later. Profoundly affected by his Holocaust experience. One of the reasons why I believe the New York Times obit writer said that Halivni was something of a theologian, right? So that kind of like backhanded reference to him as a theologian it's not entirely accidental. The Times reviewer knew that Halivni had written 3 books of theology, but the reason why Halivni often doesn't get his due in certain circles of theology is because of how theology is constructed as a field, particularly in the United States, and particularly under the dominance of Protestant theology, which is the general rubric in which theology happens or has happened in the last 200 years in the West. That rubric privileges abstract, philosophical, systemic thinking. And within that framework, someone like Maimonides is an ideal theologian because he was an abstract, philosophical, systematic thinker. Someone like Halivni is not, because he never set out to create a systematic philosophy of Jewish theology. What Halivni represents is a much more traditional model of Jewish theology. And so I think we as Jews need to acknowledge that our own learning discourse has different contours than the learning discourses of the society around us. And what it means to do theology as a Jew is different. Much of Jewish theology has historically taken the form of manipulations of canonical texts, interpretations of canonical texts, biblical interpretation of biblical mythology, even the story we were talking about before about Moses and the coal. That's a kind of theology that's going on there. Through the gap filling and the additional storytelling, expanding the myth to new areas allows you to have a different understanding of the role that God is playing in the selection of Moses, the hand of God that's guiding history. You can see this most clearly in a Jewish theologian who is typically acknowledged as a theologian, Judah Halevi, the Spanish theologian who ends up leaving Spain with the rise of the Almohads in 1147 and going to the land of Israel, where according to legend, he dies on the spot because a horse tramples him while he's bending down to kiss the ground. And again, that legend, probably not true, but it's indicative of the fact that we have no record of Halevi living in Israel. We have a record that he left, no record of him getting to Israel or doing anything in Israel. So he was probably in Israel for a very short period of time, which is why a legend is created about how short. But, Halevi was a post-philosophical, he was not someone who wasn't aware of Greek philosophy. He was very aware of Greek philosophy. He grew up as a contemporary of Maimonides. He had the same cultural training as Maimonides, but he rejects philosophy because he doesn't want to give up on the theology that starts with the creation story, the revelation story. And so rather than starting over from a philosophical Aristotelian model like Maimonides does, Judah Halevi says, no, for me, the most fundamental event in history is that 600,000 men with an equal number of women and children stood at Sinai and interacted with God directly and received the 10 Commandments, and everything else flows from that. He wants a providential relationship with God. He wants God to be active in history. He wants Judaism to be about that relationship. Halivni is a Judah Halevi style theologian. He also wants the biblical myths to be active and something that we use to think through as a way of describing our relationship with God. But Halivni, as I mentioned before, is animated by a number of other things. So how does he deal with it? So he comes up with a theology of what he calls Chatu Yisrael, that I will try to summarize for you. Before I get into the ramifications, I will summarize this for you. And I have a handout, so maybe I'll stop the share and share something else. Okay, are you seeing that now? How about now? Yes? Okay, terrific. Thank you. Anonymity does something rather amazing in his theology, and it's something that kind of develops throughout the 3 books of theology. And so some of his theology is kind of repetitive because he's working out some ideas. So I'm just going to summarize and distill in like 10 minutes the new narrative, the new mythological narrative that he is activating to produce a kind of new theological understanding of Jews' relationship with revelation. So Moses and the giving of the Torah at Sinai takes place around the 12th century BCE, according to the chronology of the Hebrew Bible. So if you accept the chronology of the Hebrew Bible, and if you accept Revelation as a historical episode, it should have happened around 1200 BCE. Here's what we know about the history of Israel. If you trust the Bible itself, then around the year 1000, that's around the reign of King David. But a few years before that, you had the rise of the unified monarchy of Saul, followed by David, followed by Solomon. So around 1000 BC. So between 1200 BCE of Moses receiving the commandments and 1000 BCE, which is the first monarchy, there's a 200-year gap. According to the Bible, that's the gap of Joshua entering the land of Israel. It's the gap of the period of the Judges. It's very clear to us that during that period, the Israelites were not monotheists. Many of them worshipped multiple gods. They also were not aniconic. Many of them worshipped icons of deities, whether the God of Israel or other gods. They worshipped these icons. They had these home icons that archaeologists have found, right? So we know, and the Bible talks about it. If you read the book of Judges, every chapter is all about how the Israelites are sinning again because they're offering sacrifices to Baal and Asherah and these other deities, right? So we know that up to between 1200 and 1000 wasn't a very religious group by later biblical standards. But it's even more than that. If you read the Bible carefully, between 1000, the United Monarchy, and 930, when the United Monarchy splits into 2, they're also not monotheists or aniconic. And more than that, if you go from 930 to 722, when the northern kingdom of Israel, because between 930 and 722, you have 2 kingdoms, the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. Between 930 and 722 in the Bible, it's very clear that the northern kingdom is not aniconic, right? They still have icons. And it seems like they're worshiping Baal and Asherah a lot. And even in Judea, which looks like it's maybe a little bit better on this front, part of the narrative of what's happening between 722 and 587, when the Babylonians destroy Judea, is you keep having to have these reformer kings like Hezekiah and Josiah who are coming to root out these religious practices, because every few years these religious practices return. The people once again become iconic. They're sort of worshiping icons, and they're becoming, polytheistic. So in rabbinic literature, this sometimes is referred to as Chatu Yisrael, Israel sinned, which theologically is activated because of the covenant to explain why bad things happen. Bad things happen because Israel sinned. And in fact, it shows up a lot in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel and Judges and the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. What keeps happening? Israel gets punished. It has a military defeat at the hands of the Philistines or the Ammonites or the Assyrians or the Babylonians or whoever they're being defeated by. And either the writer of the text or a prophet in the text or one of the prophets in the books of prophets will say, well, you know why that's happening? It's because Israel sins, because Israel keeps doing these things where they're worshiping icons and they're not committed to monotheism. And one of the hard things for people post-Holocaust is that this Chatu Yisrael approach to theology is one of the oldest and strongest approaches, that the way you deal with Jewish tragedy is to look inward and say, we are responsible for it, that it's that God is lashing out against us. But for survivors, in the wake of the Holocaust, as the most traumatic disaster in Jewish history, there was a very resounding response by survivors, never again to that theology, right? We're not going to accept that approach anymore. There is not going to be someone, we're not going to sit by and have someone say that the 6 million were killed because of their sins or our sins. I mean, various post-Holocaust theologians deal with it in their own way. Halivni deals with it in a way that someone who is very committed to texts and very committed to interpretation and very committed to history does. What he ends up doing is he ends up historicizing the notion of Chatu Yisrael and historicizing it so that it helps him out. He's got a new approach. What's his new approach? He acknowledges that from the time of the 10 Commandments in 1200 until the time of Ezra, who returns from Babylonia to the land of Israel after the destruction of the first temple, in order to lead the people to resurrect and recreate the second temple and to teach them Torah and to teach them Judaism, that entire time period between Moses and Ezra now becomes labeled by Halivni the Chatu Yisrael time period, the Israel sinned time period. And this has a number of ramifications. What this does is it allows him to say, you want to know when the real revelation was? Real revelation wasn't at Sinai. Oh, sure, there was revelation at Sinai, and it was very important. But the real revelation at Sinai was eclipsed by the revelation of Ezra. Ezra came and taught the Torah to the people of Israel in the post-temple period, activating the original spirit that animated the earlier revelation. But because so much time had elapsed between 1200 and 400, between Moses and Ezra, that the thing that Ezra had to do was Ezra had to become essentially a text critic. He was receiving a text that was messed up. The game of telephone, of transmission, for 800 years had been played by people who were living in a society that was inherently sinful, polytheistic, and icon worshippers. They weren't good at preserving God's word to Moses, and so Ezra had to reconstruct, and so what this does, well, I'll get to ramifications. So on the text that I have here, he is drawing on traditional sources in order to support this new approach. So he finds a Mishnah in Tractate Para, a tractate that deals with the question of the Para Aduma, the red heifer, whose sacrifice and ash sprinkling is central to purification from the worst kinds of impurities in the Bible. And there's a whole tractate devoted to that, to the laws related to that. And at some point they wanted to know, at some point the Mishnah talks about, that there were residues of 7 red cows. And if they didn't find the ashes of the residues, they performed the sprinkling with those of 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, because the Mishnah had stated earlier that there were historically only 7 of these red heifers. And who prepared these? The Mishnah now says, Moses prepared the first, Ezra prepared the second, and 5 were prepared from the time of Ezra, the words of Rabbi. So between the time of Ezra to the rabbinic period, that's when the other ones were prepared. But Halivni is saying, look, it's clear that the rabbis in the Mishnah, who are playing a similar game in terms of theology, animating earlier sources, sort of dealing with mythic sources as if they're historical and filling gaps in, they think that basically you've got Moses, and then there's a jump from Moses to Ezra. Like everything in between is just skipped over entirely. So while Ethics of the Fathers says Moses transmitted to Joshua, and Joshua transmitted to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and there's all these links in the chain, in this Mishnah, Mishnah Para, there's no links. It's Moses and then Ezra. And so Halivni takes from that an invitation to, that's what's going on. Moses and Ezra. Ezra is the sort of resurrector of the Mosaic tradition. He then finds this passage in the Talmud tractate Sanhedrin, page 21b. This is a text that has to do with the Hebrew language and its history of transmission. Mar Zutra says, and some say that it is Mar Ukva who says, Mar Zutra and Mar Ukva were second generation Babylonian rabbis, so people from the 3rd century CE. Initially, the Torah was given to the Jewish people in Ivrit script, the original form of the written language, right? So if you've ever seen one of those historical records, the text that we now think of as Hebrew, the font, the character set that we think of as Hebrew, that's actually Aramaic. That's under the influence of Aramaic, we started writing Hebrew in Aramaic characters. But there's actually a completely different font. You can go on Wikipedia and find this in a few seconds. A completely different font of, sometimes it's called Paleo-Hebrew. But it's the original Hebrew script. So Mar Ukva says initially, so obviously in the 3rd century CE, they're aware of this, that originally the Torah was given in a different script. And in the sacred tongue Hebrew. It was given to them again in the days of Ezra in Ashurit script, so that's an Aramaic script, and Aramaic tongue. That's not a good translation. Oh, no, sorry, it is. An Aramaic tongue. The Jewish people selected Ashurit script, so Aramaic font, and the sacred tongue, so Hebrew, for the Torah scroll, and left Ivrit script, so Paleo-Hebrew, and the Aramaic tongue for the commoners. Now I'm going to skip ahead. They talk a little bit about the Samaritans. I'm going to skip that. It is taught in a Braita and Tosefta. Rabbi Yossi says. So Rabbi Yossi is a 4th generation Tana from the earlier period. So he's from the mid 2nd century. Ezra was suitable for the Torah to be given by him to the Jewish people had Moses not come first. With regard to Moses, the verse states, and Moses went up to God. With regard to Ezra, the verse states, this Ezra went up from Babylon. Just as the going up stated here is Torah, so too the going up stated there is Torah. This goes on. Down here it says, with regard to Ezra, the verse states, for Ezra had set his heart to seek the Torah of the Lord, and even though the Torah was not given by him, the script was changed by him, as it is said, and it quotes this verse from Ezra, was written in Aramaic script set forth in the Aramaic tongue. Now, this is the key part of the passage for Halivni. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who is the editor of the Mishnah, says, initially the Torah was given to the Jewish people in this script, meaning in Aramaic. Sorry, in the Aramaic characters. Once the Jewish people sinned, it turned into an impairment for them, and they began writing it with a different script. So I'm not going to get too involved in this, but what essentially is going on in this passage is that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi is saying that what Ezra is doing, he is disagreeing with what's going on in the book of Ezra. Rather than saying that Ezra is transforming the original form to a new form, he is saying that Ezra is recovering the original form that sin had impaired. That the period of sin had distorted the language and the fonts, and Ezra comes along and Ezra fixes it. And the last text is from Bamidbar Rabbah, from Numbers Rabbah, which is a midrashic text that's dated to the 8th or 9th century CE. And they ask the question, and there are those who say, why are the words dotted? Why is it that in the Torah scroll, there's a few places like when Esau kisses Jacob, the word Vayishakehu, and he kissed him, has dots above it. So again, from a historical perspective, it probably means that the text wasn't originally there in some versions of the text, and some scribe is sort of noting that it wasn't originally there. Jewish commentators have gotten creative with this, and they talk about how the dots represent the teeth marks, because Esau, when he went to kiss Jacob, he actually tried to bite him in the neck. But according to the Midrash, like his neck turned into like a solid marble. And so Esau wasn't able to break skin, but he was able to get bite marks in the marble, right? And so their Jewish commentators made the dots meaningful in this other creative way. Well, Bamidbar Rabbah has another explanation. There are those who say, why are the words dotted? Because this is what Ezra said. Ezra was a scribe. He put the dots on it. If Elijah comes and asks, why did you write the dots on them? I'll say to him, oh, you mean they weren't supposed to be there? I've already dotted them for removal. And if he tells me I've written well, they should be there, I'll just erase the dots. I'll erase the dots from above them, right? So this is an explanation of the dots in the Hebrew Bible as a hedge. It's a hedge, like Ezra doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know, should he take these words out or should he put them in? For Halivni, this is significant because it allows him to say, look at the foundational work that Ezra is doing. Ezra is a crucial component. Ezra plays a crucial role in reestablishing the correct revelation text that was originally given to the Jews on Sinai. But that role has to be played by someone who is effectively a text critic, someone who has the ability to look at things and say, here's a logical flaw and I need to fix it. And someone who licenses themselves to change the version of the text a little bit. Halivni basically creates Ezra in his own image. Ezra is a Bible critic, but he's really a Talmud critic, right? So back to I want to talk about the ramifications of his. So he has a number of ramifications theologically. One of the amazing things that he does with this whole setup in his book, Pshat and Drash, he also does this in Midrash, Mishnah, and Gemara, is he tries to flip the age-old Jewish commentarial preference for Pshat. So if you've ever studied the Bible with commentary, typically it's understood that there's multiple levels of understanding of the Bible, that there's like basic meaning, which is usually translated as Pshat, and then there's Midrash, which is the Bible understood with the kind of gap-filling reading tendencies of the rabbis. And then there are also two forms of mystical interpretation. One is like numerological, that involves like doing mystical math and adding up what the letters mean. And another one that is a different form of mystical reading that thinks of the Bible in deep allegorical terms. That sort of everything in the Bible is really corresponding to something that exists in the mystical universe. You think it's talking about the patriarchs? It's not. It's talking about these manifestations of God that roam around in the ether. Right. So, but within just the first two, between the sort of Pshat and Drash, typically, particularly among Jewish intellectuals, Pshat is the sort of the literal meaning is privileged over Drash, particularly in modernity, particularly post-Enlightenment. Post-Enlightenment, when the Protestants were going back to the text and everyone was trying to understand the original languages, and it's like, what I want to understand is, what did the Bible mean at the time? I don't care about what the later figures interpreted the Bible to mean. What's interesting about Halivni's theology is it sets up a situation in which, for him, in some sense, Midrash is better than Pshat, because he values Ezra's reinterpretation of Revelation over Revelation itself. And there are places that he actually will say things like this. He's not as interested in what the Bible's text originally was. He's more interested in Ezra's reconstruction of the text. This allows him to do Bible criticism, but to do it in a way that celebrates traditional readings over the literary readings or the literal readings. So that's one thing. The other thing that his theology does is it turns the Bible critic into a religious reader. It's a religious reader who is following the model of Ezra. Ezra is a critic, and therefore what I am doing as a Talmud critic or a Bible critic is I'm following in Ezra's footsteps. And so what I'm doing is fundamentally not just a form of religious reading, but the form of religious reading. It is the thing that gets me back to the important revelation, to the important understanding, the revelation that was not sullied by the sin of Israel. And this is, I mean, I'm repeating myself now. Ezra was a proto-stam. Ezra is like the anonymous editors of the Talmud, right? In the same way you have your anonymous voice of the Talmud. And for Halivni, those were the Savoraim. They were distinguished rabbis. They were important rabbinic figures. They are religious leaders who can be venerated. By turning Ezra into a similar kind of figure, he allows you to kind of go back and forth between Bible critic and Talmud critic. So one way of thinking about it is that Ezra is a proto-stam. Ezra is doing the same thing that the anonymous editors of the Talmud were doing. So if anyone has a problem thinking that Halivni is somehow minimizing or desacralizing or taking away the religious benefit of the anonymous editors of the Talmud, he can say to them, but they're doing what Ezra did. They are doing the most important religious work. So I'm going to close here by trying to reflect a little bit about. I'm going to try to reflect a little bit about the relationship between his theology and his methodology. To a large extent, they're animated by different aspects of his personality. The Talmud commentary is animated by his inherently critical sensibility, and the theology is more profoundly animated by his experience as a survivor, his experience of loss, his experience of losing his family. But he was a single person. And so you can see in his theology a kind of attempt to bridge these things. He is fascinated, he is forever fixated theologically on revelation. Revelation at Sinai is a profoundly important event. But as he says in his later works, it's eclipsed by the revelation of Auschwitz. And so his personal experience of feeling like God was absent, you know, his Sigurder contemporary, Elie Wiesel, famously writes that God died at Auschwitz. Halivni didn't like that, because for him, God wasn't dead. God was very much an active presence in his life. God was absent at Auschwitz. And in order to deal with that theologically, what he does is he talks about, he invokes what is essentially an essential component of Hasidic mysticism. Isaac Luria's notion of tzimtzum, this notion that when God created the world, at the moment of creation, because God is everything, the only way that creation could work was by God creating a vacuum in space that was not occupied by God, into which God could create the world. This is Luria's notion of tzimtzum. Halivni activates Luria's notion of tzimtzum to say that God was absent in the Holocaust in the same way God was absent at in the space of creation. People are sometimes puzzled about, you know, Halivni's use of Luria, but again, because Halivni was Hasidic, it's not surprising to me. He grew up in a Hasidic home. Hasidism is suffused with Lurianic mysticism. So the notion of tzimtzum is something, or this notion of divine contraction or divine absence, is a natural category for him to use. So he used this category of absence, of divine contraction, as a way of dealing with his perception, his experience of the absence of God. But as a kind of Judah Halevi style theologian, he didn't want an absent God. He wanted a God who was present. He wanted a providential God. And the way to activate that providential God was to go back into Jewish mythology, go back into the theological myth of revelation, and figure out a way to make that myth of revelation function for him. For it to function for him, it had to take into account the problems of textual transmission, the problems of logical contradiction, and the challenges of the value of textual criticism. And so he produced this alternative narrative. There was a revelation at Sinai. That revelation was marred by the fact that for 800 years afterwards, people were not listening. And so they didn't do a good job preserving the law as demanded. And it took an Ezra to come along and resurrect that revelation using the tools of an editor or a critic. And with that in mind, you can understand Revelation to be a top-down thing where God broke into history, as Halivni used to say over and over again. God broke into history and gave the Torah to the Jewish people, and yet that Torah is inaccessible without the work of human beings who are functioning as editors and critics to make this work better. One of the things that Halivni, one of the starkest places in his theology, he rarely went on the attack, but occasionally his attacks, peek through. There's one place where he says those people who simply accept the fact that God broke into history and gave us the Torah, and everything else is halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Everything else has to be understood to be the tradition given to Moses at Sinai, and we have to just accept it on faith and not use our own logic to intervene. He says, I see the outcome of that. I see what happens to women, particularly in society, when ultra-Orthodox rabbis have this mentality that they are the mouthpiece of what is originally a divine message. He was very offended by, particularly in the Israeli context, how ultra-Orthodox rabbis spoke in the name of Jewish tradition and in the name of Jewish law. And so for him, he needed to come up with a theological narrative that would allow the editor, that allow the critic like himself, the space to be able to reframe and change things fundamentally for Jewish life. I'll stop there and open it up for questions. I'm not, Beit Sefer 2:2.
Nope, that's just me.
I know, do you have a question?
It's just me. Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Wimpfheimer? No?
Thank you, Paul.
I have lots of questions, but not enough time. I'm dumbfounded to ask anything at this point without taking another hour to answer it. So I'm not going to go there, but I am profoundly taken with your presentation, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul.
You're here.
Thank you, Rick. Okay, and Helene, when you're listening to this, undoubtedly on recording, thank you once again, and refuah shalema.